We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Damon McCoy from NYU. Damon does really exciting research studying cyber criminal activity. He has done a lot of good stuff looking at all sort of the dark corners of the internet that you didn't even know existed. So he did his PhD at the University of Colorado and has since worked on one of the leading teams in doing cybercrime measurement work. And so we're very grateful to have him here today. And I won't waste any more of your time. And so, Damon, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for coming to the talk. I'm up here speaking, but this is really the outgrowth of work from a large number of researchers. So picture 20 people at least plus working on this work from lots of different institutions, from a lot of the UC systems, from a lot of industry partners like Google and such that have contributed to helping us make this work actually possible. And so to begin with, I'm going to kind of give some motivation for this talk. And so probably a lot of people in this room are computer scientists or kind of technology focused. And so a lot of times when we think about cybercrime, when we think about cybersecurity, we think about it through this kind of narrow technical lens, where we kind of hone in on the technical aspects of cybercrime. And kind of what I'm going to try and motivate through this research is if you look at cybercrime through this very narrow lens, oftentimes it's kind of one piece of the puzzle. And with only one piece of the puzzle, oftentimes you don't arrive at very good solutions some of the time, or at least not optimal solutions. And what you oftentimes run into is this kind of whack-a-mole game, where you plug in one technical hole, and the attacker just kind of finds the next technical hole and gets in through there. So that's a lot of times when you try and purely combat attackers technologically, this is oftentimes what you end up with, is these whack-a-mole arms race, where it seems like the defender is kind of always one step behind the attacker in terms of securing these systems. And so a lot of the research that I'm going to be talking about is kind of talking about expanding our understanding of cyber attackers. And by this, I mean both understanding the technical parts, but also understanding kind of the socioeconomics of cybercrime. And this means looking at the actual actors, understanding their motivations, their capabilities, looking at the defenders and understanding their incentives and their capabilities and their defense structure, and kind of looking at the interconnections of these relationships. And when we kind of get this broader view, as I'll show you in this talk, we can oftentimes find places to kind of intervene on these attacks that we're seeing that can oftentimes be much more effective than just purely technological interventions on this. And so, we've been at this work for probably close to a decade at this point. And what we found from studying the cybercrime ecosystem is that a lot of it is kind of for-profit motivated, and interestingly enough, it kind of organizes itself almost like a business. And so you'll see a lot of these attackers almost kind of specializing and acting as vendors. And then these vendors kind of get together and they cobble together a set of specific specialties, and that's how they actually carry out these attacks. So it's very rare these days to see an attack that's kind of carried out end-to-end by a single attacker. It's oftentimes these kind of specialists that are kind of loosely federated and connected to actually go from, attack to actually making money and achieving their objective of their attack. And so this kind of business has kind of given rise to what we call kind of streamlined abuse. So abuse for a fee, essentially, where, again, these vendors have specialized and innovated within their specializations, and they can offer very efficient, very economical, and very effective abuse within their specialization. And as I'll show you, things like compromised machines, these are essentially raw commodities that are bought and sold. So when someone breaks into a machine, it's essentially just turned into a commodity that's used for other kinds of scams. Things like sensitive user data that are stolen, again, it's just kind of commoditized, it's aggregated into large parcels and sold off in these parcels. And then a lot of these scams actually, they both have a technical component and they also have a human component. And for this human component, again, they've kind of organized these large kind of almost sweatshop factories in these countries to satisfy this human component of their scams. And then finally, they need things oftentimes like accounts, So things like, Facebook, Google accounts to do kind of large-scale abuse. And so again, there's specializations that specialize in bypassing the registration defense of these services, registering these accounts, and then selling them off to other kinds of scammers for their various kinds of attacks. And so this is essentially what we see the underground turning into. And so this is very hard to combat because, right, just like in normal business, this kind of imbues them with a very efficient, very hard to disrupt kind of infrastructure. And that's naturally how they've evolved. But the interesting thing is that because they're kind of fragmented and segmented like this, this potentially opens up new ways of undermining the attackers. And so you don't necessarily have to kind of, undermine them head on. You can sometimes look at something deeper down in their supply chain and undermine them at some lower point in their supply chain. And so, right, this can lead to perhaps trying to exhaust a supply of some resource. This can lead to preventing payments between these various suppliers. And it can also lead, right, to targeting kind of key participants within these various specializations. And so now that I've kind of laid this out, we need some kind of real concrete framework in order to understand this. And so I'll quickly kind of run you through how this is kind of organized at a lower level. And so probably most people, if they're familiar with cybercrime, they're probably familiar with kind of the higher level scams. So, right, these are the scams that essentially are the inflow of capital into these cyber criminal systems, right? Because it can't all be sale to the trade. There needs to be some inflow of capital. And so this inflow of capital, a lot of it comes from spam-advertised goods. That's actually very profitable for them. And then, right, this emergence of this scareware and this ransomware is also kind of an inflow of capital into their systems. This other kind of attack that's called click fraud, essentially where they're stealing money from online advertisers by pretending to be potential real customers, wherein they're just bots, and they're just stealing money from the advertisers by presenting them with fake eyeballs instead of real eyeballs for their ads. And so this is, again, a huge money driver into the ecosystem. And then there's all the kind of financial fraud, like credit card theft and things like that, that are, again, right, kind of introducing inflows of capital into their systems. And then finally, there's, right, all of the major just wire transfer banking fraud, which also kind of injects capital into these systems. And so these are kind of the high-level scams that probably most people are aware of. So beneath these is this huge support infrastructure. And the support infrastructure is all of this kind of specialized infrastructure that helps kind of make these higher-level scams more efficient and more scalable. And so these are things like essentially malware, so specialized malware payloads. These, a lot of times, are just almost off-the-shelf malware. So there'll be a team of malware writers that maintain these well-known pieces of malware, and then they're simply sold or rented to people, sometimes with support contracts, sometimes not with support contracts, to various other kinds of scammers for them to be able to drive money from these. And then, right, the other thing they need once they have the malware is they need to infect people's machines. And so, again, we see the specialization of these kind of exploit malware distribution services. And these are, again, almost shrink-wrap packages where people are writing these exploit kits, and then, again, right, they sell them or rent them by the month to various attackers to distribute their malware more efficiently. And so the other thing, right, okay, so now you have the malware, you have the distribution. The next thing you need is, right, you need victims to visit your exploit kits. And so, again, this has been commoditized, and so there's various actors that will sell you what's called traffic, essentially, right, targets to try and infect with your various malware operations. And so, again, this has all been completely commoditized at this layer. And then beneath this is almost like the raw material commodity layer. So you can think of this like your, in the real business world, like copper and brick and things like that. In this world, this is things like, malicious hosting and proxies and domain names, and then human services like CAPTCHAs. So that squiggly text that you have to type in, there's actually human-based CAPTCHA solving farms that will solve those for very low amounts of money. And as defenses have improved, so now you have to type in that text code in order to create the account or log in. So again, they just, now they have things where they just have robotic arms that move around SIM chips and solve those SMS challenges for you, kind of automated. And so all of this, again, is just provided as a service that kind of builds up to these higher level scams. Okay, so now once they have these, we can just quickly look into some of their big profit centers. And so one of their major profit centers I'm going to do a deep dive on, probably was and still partially is, right, counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Another one that's been growing recently is counterfeit luxury goods. And another one that has also been rising, this one's kind of interesting because this one isn't wholly illegal. They actually have lawyers and they have EULAs and they gain, for some definition of consent, but it's this whole huge industry of unwanted software. And this unwanted software, right, basically injects ads into people's pages, destroys their user experience, or distributes things like scareware, where it's AV that kind of dubious quality AV that has overpriced subscriptions, and they trick you into subscribing it. So this adware has become a huge source of profit for them. And then, right, finally, there's this ransomware where it encrypts your files and then extorts you for money. And then, right, if you dive even deeper, there's essentially what we see as like these contractors. So these hackers that kind of do data exfiltration on contract. And a lot of these people, right, are in places like China and stuff like this, and they'll do kind of espionage for contract with these various people. And so these are all kind of profit centers of this. And again, right, beneath these profit centers are the support centers. And so we kind of cobbled together some prices from, there's a lot of underground markets where people are either buying or selling or advertising services on the underground. So from these, we can kind of cobble together prices of what these various support services go for. And so, right, compromised machines. If your machine gets compromised, guess what it's worth on the underground markets? It's worth probably about 7 to 10 cents if you're in the U.S. So that's what your compromised machine sells for, is 7 to 10 cents on the open market. So again, right, this shows you when you're trying to protect a commodity that's that cheap with, a $50 subscription to AV, you can see how out of whack the financial incentives are for all of this. And so, right, and again, this is per the 1,000, these hosts. So a lot of these people are operating at such scale that they won't even sell anything less than like 1,000 to 10,000 compromising hosts. So they sell them purely as a commodity by the 1,000 to 10,000 on the open markets. And if you're talking about compromised hosts in China, those go for like a fraction of a penny. The supply and demand is such that they're that cheap. And so things like human solving services, if you want 1,000 CAPTCHA solved, it'll cost you about $1 to $2. So essentially what they've done here is they have human sweatshop CAPTCHA solving farms, normally in Southeast Asia. Essentially the places where you see textile sweatshop factories, these are the places where you'll see the CAPTCHA solving farms as well. And the wages are actually equivalent. If you do the cost breakdown of how long it takes you to solve 1,000 CAPTCHAs, it's about equivalent to what you'd make working in a textile factory. And then, right, things like accounts. So accounts for Gmail, accounts for Hotmail, they can go anywhere from, $4 to a few $100s per 1,000. Again, all of these things are in 1,000, showing you the scale at which they're operating. Okay, so I'll do a tiny little dive on how compromised machines work. So this is essentially how they've commoditized the buying and selling of people's compromised machines. And what they've done here is they've created what's called a pay-per-install market. So essentially what this means is that there's essentially this middleman that runs this pay-per-install operation. And this middleman actually doesn't compromise any machines, and this middleman actually normally doesn't distribute any malware. What the middleman simply does is this middleman will line up some clients that have some malware that they want to install on people's machines, and then they'll line up people that are good at infecting machines, and they'll have this middleman kind of market in between these two. And so for the people that are good at infecting people's machines, they'll give them a small piece of code that's called either a dropper or an install. And when someone infects this machine, they'll install this dropper or install on that machine. They'll get credited for that install, and they'll be paid by the middleman PPI market. And what this install and dropper will do is this install and dropper will reach in and install malware from the client that the PPI program has launched on that side. And so normally you'll see about 3 to 4 pieces of malware being installed per an infection. And sometimes it's intelligently striped, and sometimes they interfere with each other depending on the quality of the PPI program. But this is the commoditized market of this. Other things like stolen credit cards, they basically essentially opened up commoditized types of shops where it almost looks like an e-commerce shop where you can look, you can find credit cards, and you can add them to your shopping cart, and then you can check out your stolen credit cards and try and monetize them. So you can do searches on the internet, you can look for Carter stores, and you'll see these things like straight out of J. Crew catalogs that are selling stolen credit cards. If you dig a little bit deeper into the underground, so these are not quite as open, but if you get access to a little bit more exclusive places, you can see places where people are buying and selling data breaches from companies. And so an example of one of these was this data breach site called Enigma, where this member by the name of Diablo was asking for a copy of Ashley Madison's database. This happened probably about 2 weeks before the compromise of Ashley Madison happened. And so unclear whether it was linked together, but there was obviously demand from someone with a high reputation in the underground to buy a copy of that database. And so these are the kind of things that are supporting this infrastructure. Now that we've talked about this, I'm going to go into a deep dive about one intervention that we've done. And so when I talk about interventions in the cybersecurity space, a lot of people think about kind of systems hardening kinds of things where, right, you talk about, deploying some antivirus, you talk about making it harder for someone to install malware and stuff like that. But what I'm going to be talking about here is kind of a different approach to an intervention in cybersecurity space. And so the domain that I'm going to key in on is one of pharmacy spam. And back in the probably mid-2000s, pharmacy spam was pretty much the only spam that you ever saw. And that was because it was just so incredibly profitable for them to do. And so for this, I'm going to quickly talk about the vendors within this space. I'm going to be talking about how this business structure kind of operates. And then I'm going to start reasoning about intervention based on our measurements. And then finally talk about the impact of a payment intervention that we actually, with the help of some brand holders, pulled off. And so to begin with, right, again, these are profit-motivated attackers. And so their goal is to profit from this. But it was interesting because in one of our studies, we set about basically mapping out all of the intermediaries that need to function correctly for a piece of pharmacy spam email to actually make money. And this actually turned into a very complicated set of people. And so to begin with, right, normally you have a botnet that will initially distribute the email. Let's say the email actually ends up in a user's email box. Almost all spam has a URL that's clicked on. That's basically the only point of spam. It's you click on the URL. And this URL, right, has a domain name. And that means that these domain names need to be registered. And in this case, this actual piece of spam had a .ru domain name, which means that it had to be registered at reg.ru in Russia. And reg.ru at the time had a very bad reputation. So if you complained about bad domain names, they wouldn't take them down. They wouldn't respond to complaints, which made them heavily used by the spammers. And so after the domain is registered, the next thing that you need to do is, right, computers, they contact what's called IP addresses. So they need to translate this human-readable string into a set of numbers that are how computers basically find each other on the internet. So almost think of it like, a name, and then you have to translate it into basically a zip code. And so normally how this is done is through a domain name server that translates that human-readable string into a string that the computer can then route to actually contact that web server on the internet. And again, this needs to be reliable. And so in this example, this web server was actually hosted in China. And it was hosted at what's called a bulletproof hosting facility. Bulletproof, again, meaning that if you complain about abuse, they're not going to react unless you have, a court order or something very strong, where they basically have no other recourse but to act and take it down. And so this then resolves that domain name into an IP address. And at this point, the user's computer can actually contact that web server. And in this anecdotal example, that web server was in Brazil. But that web server was actually just a simple ephemeral proxy. The actual content for that website, the database, none of that was on that computer. That computer was just simply taking the requests and they're going to relay them to you. And why they use these proxies is because this is a very visible part, very vulnerable part of their infrastructure. And so these websites get taken down by the hundreds daily by various people on the internet. And so for this reason, they made them very cheap and very disposable infrastructure. And so they hide the more costly infrastructure. The more costly infrastructure was actually on a server sitting in Russia. And so this kind of gets to almost the linchpin of pharmacy spam. And so the organization running the web server was what's called an affiliate program in English, partnera, for those of you that can speak Russian. And so this affiliate program went by the name of Mailian. And they were this large business entity that basically they were the key infrastructure within the spam economy. And so what this affiliate program does is they actually pay the spammers on commission. So the spammers are just simply marketers, independent marketers that are being paid on commission to generate quality leads and sales for these illicit pharmaceutical programs. And the other thing they do is they run the back-end databases for these e-commerce sites, and they provide the marketing material for the spammers. So they either control these sites or they provide the marketing material for the spammers to set up their own sites, depending on the structure of this. Okay, so this is all the technical infrastructure. So this can be mapped out, writing technical crawlers and things like this. But there's two key pieces of their infrastructure that can't be mapped out with technical crawlers. And this is right, now that the user has this website, they can look around, there's very low cost pharmaceuticals, much lower cost than you'll find in a established pharmacy. And so if they're tempted to actually buy these, then some money has to exchange hands at this point. So if the user goes and checks out, let's say they pay by credit card, then this is going to go over the Visa network. And Visa doesn't actually settle any transactions directly. Visa just simply provides a network for banks to settle transactions amongst each other. Normally it's two banks. So the first bank is going to be the merchant bank. This is the bank that the merchant, in this case Mailian, contracted with to accept credit card payments on their behalf. And this bank was the Azerbaijani bank in Azerbaijan. So this was the merchant bank that they contracted with. And then the other bank is going to be the bank of the customer. So this is what's called the issuing bank. And so in the US, you'll notice if you have a Visa or MasterCard, it has some bank associated with it, Chase, Bank of America, stuff like this. So this would be the second bank in the transaction. And once these two banks agree on the payment, then the final piece in this value chain is the fulfillment end. And in this example, when we purchased the drugs, they were drop shipped to us from India. So again, Mailian, the affiliate program, contracted with the manufacturer and shipper in India that was able to drop ship the drugs from India into the US. And so this is the very complicated set of events that need to work properly for someone to actually profit off of a piece of spam. So, okay, now that I've laid out this value chain, I'm going to go over some other data that we kind of use to analyze this. And as luck would have it, there was a big turf war between two of the major illicit pharmaceutical operators. It began with two people, Igor Gusev and Pavel Vuviovsky. They were co-founders of one of the largest payment processors in Russia, ChronoPay. They had a falling out, and Igor left ChronoPay, and he left to start an illicit pharmaceutical operation. So he started GlabMed, which turned into one of probably the second largest illicit pharmaceutical operation on the internet. And at some point, the anti-spam activists put enough heat on GlabMed that GlabMed in public said that they shed all their big botnet spammer customers. But what they really did is they opened a sister program called Spamit. And as the name will imply, this is where they housed all their big botnet spammers. And so Pavel got jealous of all the money that Igor was making, and Pavel started up his own illicit pharmaceutical program. And his program was Arch Promotions. And as part of the turf war, they basically wanted to try and get each other arrested. And as part of their crusade to get each other arrested, they leaked the back-end databases from each other's operations. And so this data was leaked to a reporter by the name of Brian Krebs, who then gave it to us to do kind of the forensic accounting of these databases. And at a high level, what we found when we did the forensic accounting was $185 million in gross revenue. For Gladman and Spammit, this was over about 2.5 years. For Arch Promotions, this was over about a year. We also found over 1 million customers had ordered from these illicit pharmaceutical shops, 1.5 million purchases. Notice there's more purchases than there are customers, which means that a lot of them are reordering. So this is actually a non-trivial source of revenue for these illicit pharmaceutical shops, is the reordering. And then finally, we saw a little over 2,000 of the independent marketers, normally spammers. So some of these were some of the largest botnet masters operating at the time of these leaks. And in another study, we were able to, so this is limited to these essentially 3 different affiliate programs. In another study, we were able to estimate the annual gross revenue across pretty much all of the major illicit pharmaceutical shops. And we did this using very sophisticated math. So what we did is we placed a purchase, and we had an order number that normally had some orders. We placed another order, and we received an order number that was slightly larger than this. And so we could subtract the 2 numbers and divide by the period of time, and we could get some order volume. And from these backend databases, we can then multiply it by the average order size that we saw from these databases. And from this, we could actually test it against the leaked ground truth data, and it was highly accurate. It was about within 5 to 10% accurate of their actual gross revenue, and we call this purchase pair. So when we did this, we estimated that they were making about $500 million in gross revenue back in 2009 when we did this study. Okay, so these are kind of the high-level statistics. So the other thing we can do is, we have much finer grained data from these backend databases. And from this, we can essentially decompose the business model of these spammers. And it turns out that they have a lot of costs. This is actually a business for them. And about 70 to 75% of their gross revenue went to direct costs incurred in every sale. And the largest of these costs were the commissions, the marketing commissions that they were paying to the spammers. So the spammers actually earn the largest cut of each individual sale. And normally the affiliate programs made it up by dealing with multiple large affiliates. So normally a major affiliate program might make revenue on par with a very large botnet operator, because normally very large botnet operators work with multiple affiliate programs. And so they normally made about 30 to 45% commission. If you're a better spammer, you can demand a larger cut of the commissions. And then the other thing is the supply costs. The supply costs were actually fairly minimal. It was about 15 to 20%. And ironically, it actually cost more to drop ship these drugs into the U.S. than it did to manufacture them, so that this was dominated by their shipping costs. The next thing you can notice is their payment processing fees that they're paying to accept those credit card payments. And these are about 10 to 15%. Anyone that knows the credit card processing industry knows that this is highway robbery. These are outrageously elevated transaction fees. Normally, if you're a reputable merchant, you're paying about 2, maybe 3% at the absolute highest for credit card processing fees. And so I'll get back to why they're paying this premium, but there's definitely a reason why they're paying such a premium in their payment process. Finally, they have some indirect costs, and the bottom line is that they're profitable, but they're not wildly profitable. This is essentially a retail business that they're involved in. So they're making about 10 to 20% margins on their revenue. And this all kind of adds up to the fact that, yes, they are a business and they're vulnerable to economic disruption. So if we could figure out how to raise the costs in any one or several of these areas, that would probably dissuade a lot of people that are actually very savvy businessmen into perhaps going into other endeavors instead of backing spam-based business. Finally, the last thing we can do is we can do an analysis of where their money came from. Because there are several ways of accepting payments online these days. And so while there's credit cards, there's also things like wire transfer, MoneyGram, Western Union. There's things like ACH, e-checking, and things like this. There's now Bitcoin. So some of them started accepting Bitcoin. We actually did a purchase using Bitcoin. We developed some algorithms to trace Bitcoin flows within the blockchain. If anyone knows what that is, basically the public ledger. And as far as we could tell, we were the only ones that ever purchased using Bitcoin from one of these illicit farmers. So that payment method didn't work out for them. In fact, pretty much all of the payment methods did not work out for them except for credit card payments. So 97% of their revenue is derived from payment processing. We can read on the underground forums where they tried a number of schemes. And every time they tried one of these schemes, everyone complained that it was pretty much a complete failure. And so this means that they're heavily dependent on credit card processing. Okay, so now just quickly, let me flip back to the spam value chain. So we had this anecdotal example of the spam value chain. And right, the big question is, we don't have the resources to disrupt all of the parts of their business. So what is kind of the key part where we can focus our resources on, where it might actually have a material impact on reducing the spam problem by disrupting their revenue? So this is kind of the key question. And in order to do this question, we have to go from kind of these small scale studies to a larger scale study of the whole spam economy. And in order to do this, we rounded up a large number of grad students and we set them about writing lots of technical infrastructure for us to be able to measure the spam ecosystem at scale. And to begin with, we started with a whole bunch of spam feeds. And from these spam feeds, we mined out the URLs. The largest of these spam feeds was from a major free webmail provider. And we had close to 1 billion of these URLs that we mapped out from these spam feeds. So we had very high volume spam feeds at the time. Of these, there were about 17 million unique domains from these URLs. And so based on this, we set about writing some crawler infrastructure. In order to crawl the domain infrastructure, that is very easy. The grad student that pulled that basically pulled the long straw from the stack. So I think he wrote this in about a day, and it was working for the entire study. It never broke, as far as I can tell. Unfortunately, one of our other grad students is now at Facebook. She drew the short end of the straw, and she had to write the web crawler. And it turned out with the web crawler that they started blacklisting us. So they noticed that we were visiting lots and lots of their domains from a single IP address from something that didn't look like a real web browser. And so she had to go through several iterations. Finally, what we arrived at was we scripted instances of Firefox, a real browser. So we ran a real browser. We set up a proxy network so that we had lots of IPs from all over the place. And this was how we managed to crawl these websites. And so once we did this, now we have a crawl of the websites and the domain infrastructure. And what we can do from this is, there's millions of domains, but there's clearly not millions of illicit affiliate programs operating. There's clearly not millions of spammers operating. And so what we need to do is we need to start clustering these things down to the actual affiliate programs. And basically how we did this is we got some grad students and they sprinkled some machine learning dust on this. So they used some basic features of the content of the HTML, and this was pretty effective at clustering together these websites. And one of the reasons why we wanted to cluster together these websites is, again, we can measure some of their infrastructure with technical crawlers, but there's pieces of their infrastructure that we can't measure with technical crawlers. And this is their payment and fulfillment end. And for this, we need to do selective purchasing. So once we did this content clustering, the next thing we did is we did some online sleuthing. I joined some of these illicit pharmaceutical programs. When I do that, I get copied their template. And then once we have copied their template, we can then reapply the affiliate program that's responsible for that cluster of content. And so when we did this, now we have actual labeled content clusters with the affiliate programs. And then we can do some very targeted purchasing to map out that payment and fulfillment infrastructure that they have. And so this is the point where I and two of our grad students set about purchasing from spam advertised goods. And so, probably most people in this audience, as I did when I started purchasing spam advertised goods, think this is all a scam, You're not going to get anything, and they're just going to steal your money. So this is probably most people's perceptions of spam, if you've thought this hard about spam. When we did this purchase, surprisingly, packages started arriving. And these packages looked awfully like the goods that we were ordering. So when we ordered, over-the-counter medications, they came blister-packed, lot numbers. We could trace these lot numbers back to generic manufacturers in India. And, their fulfillment end is actually fairly legitimate where these businesses go. Occasionally, we would get the interesting package. It's a little bit dark in here, but essentially, this was a smuggled package. So it was a painting, kind of like an Indian kind of painting. We obviously didn't order any Indian paintings. We ordered pharmaceuticals and luxury goods. And so we noticed a bump in the back. We cut open the back of the painting, and out come our pharmaceuticals. But this is very much the exception. We've done, hundreds, close to 800 of these. We had an OCD grad student that organized all of our drugs before she went off to her professor job. And so, right, we've done many of these. And, along with all the stories, we can also do some analysis now of this spam economy. And what we did is we were essentially looking at this ecosystem and looking at all the different providers of these various support services that are happening in spam. And I'm going to kind of cut to the chase. We looked at hosting. There was some concentration, but there were hundreds of bad hosting facilities that hosted these websites. In terms of domains, there were, some concentration again, but again, there were, lots and lots of bad registrars out there. Where we did find a very large amount of concentration was in the merchant banking end of this business. In fact, we saw only 3 banks that accounted for 95% of all the spam that we began. And one of these banks at the time was the AG Bank in Azerbaijan. They mostly did the counterfeit pharmaceuticals. We had the St. Kitts Bank that mostly did the counterfeit luxury goods. And we had the DB and Nord Bank. The DB and Nord Bank is a little bit deceptive, right? That's a legitimate European bank. It turned out it was actually the Latvian branch of the DB and Nord Bank. There's a very small tail. So we saw very few merchant banks that were willing to deal with these customers. We as computer scientists didn't understand how the credit card processing world worked. We bought some credit card processing for dummy books, and we realized that this business is what's called high-risk credit card processing. And there's very few banks that are willing to deal with high-risk credit card processing, and those banks that are willing to deal with it are going to do a lot of due diligence. If they don't do this due diligence, the bank is ultimately liable for any, debts that the merchant leaves. So if the merchant has high chargebacks, if the merchant incurs some fines from Visa or MasterCard, the bank is going to be liable for these if they don't pass them on to the merchant. So for this reason, right, banks are set up to manage liability and risk. That's their whole business. And so for this reason, there's very few banks that will even deal with this, and those that will are going to do a lot of due diligence. They're going to want to shake your hand. They're going to want to make sure that you have a history of being a good, illicit pharmaceutical merchant before they're going to onboard you onto their system. And they're also going to want a lot of upfront capital from you to insulate themselves from the risk of these fines. And as you bring in revenue, they're going to keep a chunk of that revenue back to insulate themselves from risk as well. And so all this adds up to this very high switching cost. So unlike domains and websites where you can replace them for a few bucks in minutes to hours, these banking sites are going to cost you tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars and take you weeks to months to find a new bank if you lose one of these banks. And so with this finding, we published our results, and they caught the notice of a lot of policy people. They caught the notice of the White House. They caught the notice of a large industry trade group called the International Anti-Counterfeit Coalition, and these two essentially joined forces. They invited Visa and MasterCard to a meeting, and in this meeting, Visa and MasterCard agreed to stricter self-regulation of their merchants and of the banks that onboard high-risk merchants. And so the outcome of this was essentially a major tightening of availability for these high-risk merchant accounts. And so instead of 10 to 15%, they were now charging 20, 25% in transaction fees. The fees from Visa and MasterCard levied against the banks, they started at $25K, and they got progressively worse as more and more fines were levied against the bank. And depending on the bank, Visa or MasterCard would threaten them with disassociation if they didn't clean up their act and get rid of these types of merchants. So with this new policy in place, some brand holders actually replicated our test purchasing and mapping out of merchant accounts, and they actually complained to Visa and MasterCard and had the banks fined and disrupted this part of their ecosystem. So Microsoft came forward and we did counterfeit software and Microsoft replicated our method. They basically eradicated counterfeit software within a month of doing this test purchase. So it's highly effective. When Microsoft did it, a major pharmaceutical brand holder who does not wish to be named also did it. And this is the picture of all the major pharmaceutical programs back in 2011 that were accepting Visa. Within about 3 to 4 months, this was the number of programs that were accepting payments. And a lot of these, I would be worried about some three-letter agency having some investigation open to you, and that's why you're still being able to accept credit card processing. And so there was this major disruption and kind of extinction events that happened. And the other thing we can do is, right, we have these underground forums where these affiliates talk about their business. And in these forums, there's people that take down domains and they take down botnets, and we had never seen a post quite like this one in the underground forums. So they were experiencing a lot of disruption in their business because of this. So let me just quickly wrap this up. So essentially, in summary, right, these commoditization and vendor-like structure renders them vulnerable to these infiltrations where you can learn a lot about them. It also, right, provides ways of undermining their business, like at this payment end, that can be much more effective than purely defensive kinds of mitigations. And so this is, right, while the technical stuff is very valuable, this kind of research is also very valuable and can be very impactful in disrupting these kinds of attacks. So with that, any questions?